Okay, hello class. Good to see you today. We're a little few in number, but I understand from emails and all I get that a lot of folks are watching these online or in, I'll use an antiquated term, tape delay. You know what that might mean? Tape delay? When they used to tape. I bet that seems like a very kind of a questionable term, talk about taping something today, but we used to tape lectures. Now we record them, I guess. Okay, so I want to make sure I get this thing here because thank you. She can sign it if she wants, but I need this paper, so here you go. How are you today?
Good, how are you?
Oh, pretty good. I like to say I'm both pretty and good, but I'm not really. Pretty modifies good. It doesn't modify me. So I'm pretty good today. Okay, and there's Andreas. Good. All right, well, at any rate, enough of my silliness here. So we are finishing week 12. Okay, so isn't that great? I shrank, didn't I? Notice that? So I guess I'll stand up here. Week 12. So we're moving right along. I hope everything's going okay for you guys. You notice I did put a curve opportunity for you on the exam. You answer some silly question, you get 3 points, and that takes the high score to 100. So I figured that's fair, and it turned out to give a pretty good distribution on grades. And but if you got any concern about your average or something, be sure and reach out to me. I'm trying my best to kind of provide you with real-time stats on Blackboard regarding your grades. You know, we kind of received a little direction about that from our new president, who seems to be a great guy. But we need to be as transparent as we can about our students' position and performance in our classes. So I'm doing my best. I try to update things, but sometimes I get busy and I forget. So I think I got things up to date here a couple of days ago. So if there's anything missing, let me know for you. Okay. All right. So last time we just introduced the topic of oligopoly. We kind of cruised through chapter 12. Chapter 12, which deals with monopolistic competition. It's a very short chapter. I think around 10 pages or so of reading. Chapter 13 is a little more in depth, a little longer chapter. We'll cover a few more topics than we did in the previous chapter. So chapter 13, if I said chapter 13 is where we're going today, oligopoly. So let's see here. Okay, I want to go by the book here just a little bit, just mention some things, and then we'll get into some of the slides I have for you. So okay, so if we'll go, there we go. Thank you, Radar. Okay, so here's right out of the book, oligopoly. So you got a few large producers. Okay, so that's certainly different than we had with monopolistic competition. What you're going to see really between this market structure and the one we've just studied, monopolistic competition, is really a matter of degree. Okay, so you're talking about an intermediate position here between perfect competition and monopoly. Those are kind of the two extremes when we talk about market structure. With these two, monopolistic competition and oligopoly, we're kind of in the middle here. With monopolistic competition, you have several firms, lots of firms. You have fewer firms here, few large producers. But at any rate, each one of these producers are kind of distinctive. They have a distinct product or service or something like that, as we're going to see. You may have, though, in oligopoly, it's very common to have homogeneous products as well as differentiated products. So when we start talking about oligopolies here, and it talks about many industrial products like steel, zinc, copper, lead, and so forth, may produce kind of a homogeneous product. I mean, zinc is zinc, I suppose, okay? So if you look here at this list, I'll come back to that, but this list of oligopoly industries here, which we alluded to last time, You know, you got cigarettes and beer and so forth. So there's some differentiation there, bar soaps and so forth. But, and even breakfast cereals. But primary aluminum, you'll see here at the top, here on the right. I mean, here's Alcoa and Alcan and so forth, but their product's pretty much the same, so forth. But especially when you look at, say, petroleum, which is an oligopoly, petroleum industry. First off, in the primary stages of production, crude oil is kind of crude oil. I know crude oil coming out of Venezuela has more sulfur than light sweet Brent or what might come out of the Middle East and from the OPEC countries and so forth. Of course, Venezuela is an OPEC. I'll talk about Venezuela and OPEC here in a minute. But at any rate, where you actually pump the oil out of the ground has some effect on the chemical composition of the oil. But in fairly broad categories, crude oil is crude oil, refined products from crude oil, kerosene and those sorts of things are kind of indistinguishable between oil companies and so forth. So you may have homogeneous products or you may have differentiated products in an oligopoly. Okay, so homogeneous or differentiated products. We'll come back to that here in a minute. You have some control over price, but here's the big thing. There's mutual interdependence between the firms that make up this particular market structure. They engage in what's called strategic behavior. You'll see this, we'll talk about this in a minute. Their actions are conditioned upon the responses that their actions will evoke in their competitors. Okay? So, I mean, you may have petroleum companies, that are charging so much at the pump for gasoline and they're thinking about raising their prices. What are they going to do? They're going to look at their competitors and see how their competitors respond. We'll see in a minute that they're less likely or less inclined to raise their prices if their competitors don't. Because if you're the only one in the club that raises your prices, guess what? You lose market share. So what we're talking about in the way of strategic behavior is this interdependence and how that affects the decisions that the firms that make up the monopoly, make up the industry behave. So we'll come back to that in a little bit. There are also entry barriers in oligopoly, fairly significant. A lot of times the economies of scale is the entry barrier. Okay, so good luck if you're going to compete in big box retail. I use that a lot. But in auto manufacturing and aircraft manufacturing, in petroleum and so forth, you got huge economies of scale. So those are natural barriers to entry. So there's a club there of big oil, big steel, big tobacco, big soda, big pharma. Those are all oligopolies. There's kind of a club there, and they kind of maintain the barriers around their club because it takes a lot of capital to get started and to be able to compete in those industries in the first place. So I mentioned big oil. Okay, I wrote down a few of the companies in big oil, the major players: ExxonMobil, Shell, Chevron. We're familiar with those. And sometimes ConocoPhillips, a local Thai company there. Their headquarters used to be in Bartlesville. I think their R&D is still there. But sometimes it's considered to be big oil, sometimes it's not. Big tobacco, you got Philip Morris, you got British American Tobacco, you got Imperial Brands, okay, so forth. You got Japan Tobacco International. So kind of a club. A lot of times there'll be 6, 8 firms that make up big whatever it is, and that's an oligopoly. Big soda, okay, Coca-Cola, PepsiCo, Keurig. I brought my coffee cup in here a while ago, right? Didn't even make the connection, but I made my coffee out of my Keurig. So Keurig Dr. Pepper is another player in big soda. Big pharma, okay, as I mentioned here, Pfizer, Johnson & Johnson, Merck, Eli Lilly, AstraZeneca. Those are firms that kind of belong to a club, okay, of elite manufacturers or producers. And good luck getting into that club because it takes a lot of capital to get there in the first place. Big tech, of course, you got Microsoft and Apple, you got Alphabet, which is Google, okay? You got Amazon, Meta. Sometimes we lump in there Netflix and Oracle, NVIDIA. Big tech can mean a lot of things, but we would consider those that kind of an oligopoly, okay? So at any rate, some of these are products of mergers over time and so forth that are driven by economies of scale. You see, as I mentioned here on page 261, that some oligopolies emerge mainly through the growth of the dominant firms in a given industry. For instance, breakfast cereals, chewing gum, candy bars. For other industries, mergers have been the route to oligopoly. Steel, airlines, banking, and entertainment. There have been a number of mergers in these particular industries. We're witnessing that some of these are kind of dated, you know, steel, airlines, and so forth. Kind of in the modern era, you know, you got some high-tech mergers like with Verizon and Vodafone, which is in 2014. You got Heinz and Kraft, which was 2016. PayPal and eBay, okay, they merged, right? That's kind of recent vintage. AT&T and Time Warner, remember that one? The Justice Department, DOJ, tried to hold that up initially. AT&T, Time Warner, they merged in 2018. But the DOJ was looking at that metric we looked at last time, the Herfindahl Index, okay? So you got a horizontal merger here, not necessarily a vertical merger, but a horizontal merger. The vertical mergers, that's not a big deal as far as antitrust concerns go. In fact, that can be good for the overall economy and for the consumer if you have what are called vertical mergers. So in the petroleum industry, there's cycles of this, okay? So, you know, now we have ConocoPhillips, and you got Phillips 66 or what have you. You know, they kind of like spun off at one point back there, their distribution arm in that big company. So you kind of had a movement away. You kind of had a vertical separation. And maybe I should do this. But there are also vertical mergers, you know, that can enable a firm to deliver the product or service to the customer at a cheaper price, okay? Because they kind of internalize the middleman. I hope that makes sense, right? But when you have horizontal mergers like this, you have AT&T, Time Warner, and so forth, and communications and so forth coming together, that presents concerns, and the federal government may look at that. In particular, they'll look at this metric we looked at last time, the Herfindahl Index, and they'll look and see as the industry becomes more concentrated because of the merger, it's going to drive up that Herfindahl Index. And if it drives it up very much, by a certain percentage or what have you, then the DOJ is likely to come in and challenge the merger. So I mentioned that kind of an example there. Facebook and WhatsApp, that's another more timely merger, right? My wife uses WhatsApp. Believe it or not, I've never used it. So I've never been on Instagram either. So you're looking at a dinosaur here. I've been on Facebook, but not Instagram. ExxonMobil merged in 1998, so forth. So these are kind of more common recent mergers, more recent mergers that have kind of established big players in the field, and this is kind of an aspect of oligopoly as you have high concentration in these industries, okay? So you have big players. So you might have 4 or 5 or even up to 8 dominant firms, say, in the industry. Now, I think your book last time mentioned that if the 4-firm concentration ratio is above 40%, then you probably have an oligopoly. Less than 40%, you have less than. Okay, so that 4-firm concentration ratio kind of tells some of the story, but not all of the story. In that it tells you how perhaps half of the market looks, but not the other half. So for instance here on page 262, they have for these different oligopoly industries, they have the 4-firm concentration ratio given, and they also have the Herfindahl index given here. So what I'm saying here is that the top 4 firms in the, well, let's say the cigarette industry there, top 4 firms account for 88%, okay? 88% of the market. Now, what about the other 12%? Well, that's not very much, but that could be populated by 100 firms or maybe only 2 firms. I don't know. How did they get to 88? Maybe there's 4 firms, each have 22%. So say if there's one firm that has 20%, well, that would be part of what's left over. Okay, so that's a different story to tell, because you have really 5 big players than you would if you had 4 firms with 22% each and you had 100 firms that split the remaining 12%. So the point is, the 4-firm concentration ratio is kind of part of the story, but a more complete metric is the Herfindahl index here, where we look at practically all the firms in the industry, we square their market shares and add them together. And so remember last time when we looked at this and we calculated this for a few instances, we saw that the higher the Herfindahl index, the more concentrated the industry. So for a monopoly, the highest the Herfindahl index could be would be 100% squared, or 100 squared would be 10,000. So that's the highest the Herfindahl index can be, is 10,000. The more competitive the industry gets, the lower the Herfindahl index. So if you got to perfect competition, the Herfindahl index is practically 0. Okay, but you'll see here the Herfindahl index here for the top 50 firms. Surely top 50 firms accounts for just about the whole industry here. And small arms ammunition. Okay, who are some manufacturers of small arms ammunition? I know one person in here would know. Yeah.
Hornady.
Pardon me?
Hornady.
Hornady?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So I'll have to look them up. And I will. Okay. So Winchester, yeah. I'm trying to remember more names. Okay. And I've watched enough Westerns, I should know. Okay. Well, all right. Yeah. Small arms ammunition. There's several big names out there actually, and I'm continuing to learn on some of those. And but the 4-firm concentration ratio tells you one story, 84%. But look, the Herfindahl index is kind of a lot smaller than it is for phosphate fertilizers and so forth. So it becomes more competitive. So you have more. I guess you have more firms really in small arms ammunition than you do in, say, in the fertilizer industry, and so forth, aircraft and so forth. So at any rate, these are important numbers, the 4-firm concentration ratio, but the Herfindahl index tells you a lot more about what's going on. And so what we're going to do, I'm going to go to the PowerPoint slides now, is we're going to, with respect to oligopoly, we're going to look at 3 oligopoly models here today. Yeah, can we, Radar, can we go to the, I guess we're stuck. Can we go to the PowerPoint? Thank you. So, might be stuck. Okay, thank you. All right. Okay, so we're going to look at 3 oligopoly models today. We're going to note here that there's a lot of advertising that occurs in oligopolies. The reason is the members of the club prefer to compete on some metric or dimension other than price. So you got a lot of advertising, as we're going to see in a minute. How efficient are oligopoly industries? And then we're going to look at this strategic behavior we talked about just a moment ago. And we're going to kind of look at some examples within the discipline of what's called game theory. Okay, so oligopoly, again, there's a few large producers. The output can either be homogeneous or differentiated. So like passenger car manufacturing, what have you. I mean, there's all kinds of cars out there, right? Okay, and so, I mean, it's an oligopoly. When you talk about manufacturers of automobiles, there aren't that many firms out there that produce substantially for that market. General Motors and Volkswagen and Nissan. There's a few firms, but it's fairly highly concentrated. So it would be an oligopoly, but their output certainly is differentiated. So you got a different situation there with automobile manufacturing than you do with petroleum manufacturing. I don't know if you manufacture petroleum. What do? You produce it, I guess. There'll be, again, limited control of the price because you belong to this club. And let me just tell you here at the outset, what limits your ability to control your price if you belong to the club. So again, if you're a petroleum company and you want to raise the price of gasoline at the pump, may not be easy to do because it's pretty competitive at the retail distribution level. And if you raise your prices, you may lose a lot of market share. So there is this mutual interdependence that characterizes the oligopolies. And again, because of the size that would be required to produce anything in the first place, there's significant economies of scale, and so you have at least natural barriers to entry. All right, so we've talked about the four-firm concentration ratio and so forth. All right, so we looked at this diagram here. Notice burial caskets on the right over there. I don't even know the major firms that are into that. But alcohol distilleries, turbines and generators, and so forth. Motor vehicles over here on the right. Okay, so the four-firm concentration ratio is 60%. I'm sure Toyota's in there, right? So forth. The Herfindahl index, though, is a lot smaller. Now notice that. Why? Because there's a fairly large number of automobile manufacturers, so it makes it a little more competitive than would many of these other industries. But still, you have some dominant players that grab most of the market. Primary copper down there, compare it to primary aluminum on the right. It's a less concentrated industry, more competitive. But still, you have homogeneous output for the most part. Copper's copper. I forget where it is on the periodic table, so is aluminum. But if you want pure copper or pure aluminum, you're not, and you got it in your possession, you're not going to be able to tell where it came from. Okay, so here's the three things we're going to talk about here today. Game theory, a little bit with respect to the prisoner's dilemma, kind of models collusive or the tendency to collude within an oligopoly. And then we'll talk about what's called the kinked demand curve, and then we'll talk about price leadership. Okay, so I don't see that here. Okay, so I got what's called a payoff matrix here. We're going to look at this here in just a minute. We're going to go to the dot-com now. And I want to introduce something to you today called the prisoner's dilemma. Okay, this is just a model of oligopoly behavior. And so we got this, and I've got a handout for you. Okay, I guess I should put this online too. So let me distribute this real quick, okay? Now, again, what you have in an oligopoly is a small club. In particular, we're going to think about a club called a cartel, okay? A cartel is a club that tries to, well, if you had one in the United States, they'd probably be violating the law. They'd be violating antitrust law. But the most famous cartel in the world doesn't have a problem with that. Okay, I think there's one for him back there too. Because I would say it's the most famous is a cartel of sovereign nations. So who's going to send anyone to jail there? And this cartel, does anyone know what I'm alluding to? Oil producing, exporting countries. OPEC. Have y'all heard of OPEC? Are you familiar with OPEC? So OPEC, you know, was something you used to hear more about than you do recently because the world is not so much reliant on OPEC for petroleum as it used to be. In the United States, you know, we've kind of utilized a lot more horizontal drilling and tertiary recovery techniques and these sorts of things. But I remember, because I'm an old guy, I remember when OPEC, well, if they sneezed a little bit, the rest of the world caught cold. In that you had these countries here, and I'm just going to list them right here from your text, that formed a cartel, a club that was engaged ultimately, well, in market distribution and price fixing, if you will. The idea is every 6 weeks, the ministers from these countries, and the number of OPEC countries has changed over time. I thought there was 12. This says there's 13. But at any rate, I have trouble keeping up with this. But these are countries that meet periodically. I think it's like every 6 weeks. They send a minister to a meeting, and they agree to restrict, a lot of times, restrict output of petroleum to the rest of the world. Now it comes and goes. It's an ebb and flow thing, okay? Sometimes they'll lower their restrictions and so forth. But in the United States, it would be illegal for two companies to come together, two competitors in the same industry, to come together and say, hey, you get 1/3 of the market and I'll get 2/3 or what have you. And that way, we together, we can control the price of our good and so forth. That would be called antitrust behavior. We have laws against price fixing and market distribution determination. Okay, we have laws against that sort of thing, fixing those things. I digress here a little bit, but here's one anecdotal example. There's a lot of these. But back there, I think it was in the 1930s, very early on in the life of the Tennessee Valley Authority, the TVA, which came about in the 1930s, I believe. But you had two companies. You had Westinghouse and General Electric that sold generators, electric generators to the TVA. I don't know how big these generators were, but they sold a number of these generators to to a government agency, essentially. And what became apparent over time, because it was illegal, though. It was illegal for these two companies to get together and say, hey, let's both raise our prices. We're the only game in town. The TVA's got to pay whatever you and I determine. In other words, to fix those prices, that would be illegal. That's illegal under U.S. law. It's not illegal for sovereign oil companies to come together and fix the price of oil, either directly or indirectly. But within the borders of the U.S., for two companies to behave that way would be a violation of antitrust law. But at any rate, what became evident over time, and I don't remember the particulars of this exactly, but the low bidder in one phase of the moon, say it were General Electric, became the high bidder in the next phase of the moon. Okay, so I don't know if it was every quarter or every full moon or what, probably like every full moon, these two companies would submit bids or proposals to the TVA. TVA would bid for, the TVA would bid for their business, General Electric and Westinghouse would bid for TVA business, okay? So they would submit these bids, but the high bid would become the low bid in the next phase of the moon. Okay, so it was like this. They were able to ratchet up the price for a generator that these two firms would sell to the TVA. And it wasn't apparent at the beginning, but it became apparent over time. People in the Justice Department were scratching their heads and they're saying, hey, looky here. They're splitting the market over time and they're raising the price. And there wasn't necessarily an agreement that the two firms had inked out together, but there was some sort of informal venue. You know, you realize that in these industries, the execs all like to golf together. And while they're out on the golf course, they talk shop. And so wherever this was, whether it was at the golf course or whether it was, on the fishing lake or whatever, there was some sort of informal communication by perhaps only a wink and a nod between these two companies that, okay, this week or this phase of the moon or this month, we will submit the low bid and then we'll let you have the low bid next month, but it can be higher than what we're submitting this month. So you see how they were, again, able to kind of over time fix prices and also split the market. And that behavior was detected by the federal government and there were people prosecuted. There were execs at both companies, General Electric and Westinghouse, that were prosecuted under antitrust law for that. You can go to jail for violating antitrust law. So if the DOJ comes around and they're looking at how you're behaving with respect to your competitors and so forth in an industry like that, the best thing you can probably do is drop a few of your friends, okay, because they can get you in trouble. So at any rate, well, there's always this tendency, though, to come together and collude. You see a lot of collusion in this club here that we're talking about. I mean, it is overt, and there's no way to tell these 12 or 13 countries that they can't come together and fix prices and market shares, and that's what they do. So again, here these countries come together. They're called the OPEC countries, oil producing exporting countries, OPEC. They form a cartel, and no one's going to prosecute them. They're sovereign nations, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and so forth, United Arab Emirates. And they agree to these quotas. So here's some quotas here. It doesn't matter what these numbers are, but they'll come together every once in a while and agree on market shares, if you will, for their total output. Now, that would not be so threatening, except OPEC, first off, accounts for 38% of world production. Okay? And they also account for almost 80% of proven oil reserves. Okay? So they underproduce relative to their reserves. And OPEC's kind of famous for this, kind of like China is hoarding right now some of their rare earth minerals. OPEC tends to keep some of their oil off the market. They have the long view. They're playing the long game. So even though they have, at present, it seems that they have 80% of the proven reserves, petroleum reserves around the world, they together account for about 38% of world output. But at any rate, that's significant enough that when they come together and they divvy up that 38%, it can have an effect on the global price of oil. Okay, so they're in this to make money, and what ultimately is in the best favor for OPEC is if these 13 countries could agree to act together as a monopoly. All would agree on a certain price and so forth for a unit of oil. And so toward that goal, they'll say, okay, Saudi Arabia, you get maybe 50% of the output you can sell on the market. They go to the next country, Iraq. Maybe Iraq gets 20%. And they work their way down this list of 13 countries. So they come together and set quotas. And in setting quotas, they support a minimum price of crude oil on the global markets. And so their idea, of course, is to charge as much as they can for a barrel of crude oil that they sell without diminishing significantly OPEC's market share, which again is about 38%. We can kind of model this with this little game, if you will. And this, I wanted you to see this. This is a classic game in oligopoly behavior, because this kind of tells you the story that OPEC and other price-fixing cartels will have on their hands. There's always the incentive to cheat. So OPEC comes together and they figure out how much oil they need to bring to the market to keep the price of crude oil at $60 a barrel. That's not what it is right now, but just say $60 a barrel for crude oil. So once they achieve that agreement, if you will, then every country that meets, it has an incentive to go back home, their minister go back home, and to cheat. Okay, that is to produce more than what they agreed to. Because the price that's set at these cartel meetings is kind of sticky, if you will. Okay, so if they agree at an output level that'll support $60 a barrel, then it could be that Iraq or Iran or some of these 13 countries will go back and say, guess what, we got $60 a barrel. And that was supported because we said we would bring 4 million barrels of oil to market this month. Let's bring 4.2 million or 4.5 million. So the idea, everybody's going to factor that in. They're going to factor in that there's an incentive to welch or to cheat on their agreement. Because, alas, there's no honor. Well, there's no honor among thieves. There may not be any honor among members of a cartel. This little thought experiment kind of illustrates that. And I would be remiss if you got out of this class and you had not heard of the prisoner's dilemma. So it kind of models, again, the incentives that confront a cartel. Okay, so Thelma and Louise hang together. Everybody knows they're buddies. They hang together. The police can nail them both on a minor crime. So maybe they were engaged together in some sort of shoplifting enterprise or something like that. They helped each other shoplift. You know, they distract one distracts the security guard while the other's pulling something off the shelf. Whatever it is, okay? So they know that. They've seen them on camera and so forth. They can nail them on this minor crime. However, the police suspect the two are guilty together of a more major crime. They suspect that they're both guilty of a major crime. So somebody in the neighborhood thought, they say, this is just kind of making this up, but they thought they saw Thelma and Louise together Sunday morning carrying out a flat screen TV from someone's house in the neighborhood. You know, while the folks were at church or something like that. So, I mean, not only are they shoplifting, but, hey, they may have done some breaking and entering or what have you, okay? So, but the police don't have enough evidence. Maybe somebody thought they saw them, but there's no video evidence or anything like that, okay? So the police need a confession from one of them, okay? That's a key thing here. They need a confession from one of them to nail them both on this more serious crime. Does that make sense? So we know the police has them on a less serious crime, but they suspect them both of being guilty of the more serious crime, and they need a confession from one of them because they hang together, right? So if one of them will confess, they can nail them both. So the police take them downtown to headquarters. And the classic scene, of course, is from the movies, and I haven't watched a lot of movies, but here's what happens. The police take them downtown, and they separate them. Put each one of them in a smoke-filled room, and they're sitting at the table, right? And there's the DA or assistant DA across from the table, and there's a lamp above the table, and the assistant DA used to, at least in the old movies, used to smoke a cigarette and blow smoke in their face. But trying to get one of them to confess. Now, if the two are together in the same room down at headquarters, they can look at each other and scowl at each other and say, I'm not going to confess and you better not confess. Because if neither one of them confesses, you're over in this outcome over here. If Thelma does not confess and Louise, can you read that, does not confess, then all the police can get them on is that minor crime. So they're going to each serve 1 year. Now, who wants to go to prison for a year? I don't want to go to prison for a year. They know that. So, but we're going to use this as leverage, first off. This is something that they would avoid if they could. And so what they're going to do is going to offer each of these individuals, both Thelma and here's Louise over here, okay, if you can read that. They offer both Thelma and Louise a deal. And the deal is offered to them again separately. They're in 2 different rooms. They say, hey, if you confess, but your buddy does not confess, you get to go free. You don't even have to serve the year for the minor crime. You go free, but your buddy's going to get 4 years. Does that make sense? So they give that deal to Thelma and to Louise. Now, if they were sitting together in the same room, they could look at each other and they'd say, you better not confess. If you confess, I want to put a hit on your relatives or something, okay? So, but if they don't confess, they each get a year. And this is really the best outcome for the two together. I call this the social optimum here. You see I wrote the word social optimum here? It's better to get 2 years total in prison than anything else you're going to see in this chart. This is the better outcome for them. But since they cannot collude, that's the deal. When we separate them, that means there's no collusion. They separate them, guess what? When each deal is presented to these 2 prisoners individually, they're neither one going to trust the other. So think about Thelma for a moment. Thelma has these 2 choices. She can either not confess or confess. Okay? So Louise is going to reason in the following way. She's over in this other room. The DA's presented the deal to her, and she says, you know what? If Thelma does not confess, then I'm better off going free. You see how this little triangle here applies to Louise. So she can choose between 1 year in prison or 0. Which would you rather have? 0, right? So she's thinking, if Thelma doesn't confess, I can go free if I do confess. Or, come over here, if Thelma does confess to this major crime, then I have a choice between 4 years and 2 years, because they're going to nail me. If she confesses and I don't confess, man, I'm out on a limb by myself. I'm going to get 4 years. So I better go ahead and confess. So in other words, Louise has what's called a dominant strategy. That's the term, dominant strategy. Not every game like this couched in what's called a payoff matrix. This is called a payoff matrix. Not every game like this will have a dominant strategy for one of the players. But this one has a dominant strategy. Louise has a dominant strategy. That means regardless of what the other player does, they're going to do the same thing. Louise is going to confess to this major crime because she's better off regardless of what Thelma does. So we would say that, and I'm just going to write it right here, that Louise has a dominant strategy, and it's to confess. Okay? How about Thelma? Well, we look at the payoff strategy, or payoff matrix again. And here's Thelma over here. And Thelma's over in the room by herself, and she's wondering, well, what's Louise going to do? So she has the same deal. If Louise does not confess, Thelma has a choice between 0 years and 1 year in prison. Again, I'd rather do 0 years than 1 year. So she says, well, if Louise doesn't confess, I'm better off if I confess. If Louise does confess, then Thelma chooses between 4 and 2 years. And of course, she's better off with 2 years. So Thelma has a dominant strategy as well. Thelma's dominant strategy is to confess. Now notice something here. This is something that kind of flies in the face, if you will, of Adam Smith. Not to make too much of this. And I don't know, it's been years since I've seen the movie. Has anybody seen that movie, A Beautiful Mind? You ever seen it? Okay, that's another generation. It's the story of John Nash, who was a mathematician, economist. And not to get into detail here too much, but he sees, it's just there's a scene in the movie, and I haven't seen very many movies, but he's sitting in a bar and he sees these guys walking in with gals, and he realizes that there's kind of a game at work, like what we see here. I'll just say that much. But the idea is that there's a dominant strategy for these guys as they're kind of courting these gals walking into the bar, that both of them should kind of cheat on their rival. And that's what you have here, okay? In that both of these thieves, there's no honor among thieves, right? Both of these will have a strong incentive to cheat. And if they both cheat, you wind up over here. And we have a term for this, and I'm just going to mention it here. I'm not even going to write it on this paper, but we might talk about it more next time. But this is called a Nash equilibrium. It's named for John Nash. Got the Nobel Prize in economics back there. While he was even an old man, before he died, he kind of wandered campus at Princeton, I think. He was a very famous economist. But he kind of noted the following here. Something that kind of flies in the face of what Adam Smith told us. You remember the invisible hand with Adam Smith? Adam Smith said, if everyone in an economy pursued their own self-interest, then the economy as a whole would be better off. Okay, I'm just kind of stating the invisible hand. In a way, some people say greed is good. Okay, that's not exactly what Adam Smith said, but that's how it's often couched in the movies and so forth. But the idea is act in your self-interest. If everybody does that, the economy as a whole is better off. Okay, well, guess what? That's not exactly what happens in this situation. If we think about the economy consisting of two individuals, Louise and Thelma. Louise and Thelma would be better off over here than over here. Okay? There's only a total of 2 years in prison here. Now there's 4 here, 4 here, and 4 here. But the idea is that when they act in their self-interest, you don't wind up over here at what I call the social optimum. You don't wind up there. Acting in your self-interest does not drive the situation to the social optimum. Instead, it drives you to this thing here, which is an equilibrium. Now, I will say that your book, your particular book, talks about how this won't be sustained over time and so forth. But a lot of times the story ends here when you read this in an economics textbook. This is where the story gravitates and stays. Okay, so they both confess. Okay, now there could be more to the story than this, and we'll look here in a minute, perhaps. But the outcome here is not as desirable as the outcome here, but this is where things are going to go when the individuals act in their own self-interest. It's called the prisoner's dilemma, okay? Let me show you a prisoner's dilemma, okay? Is there any questions? Does that make sense? You might have to think about it a little bit. It's kind of a classic problem in microecon theory. Let me show you another prisoner's dilemma that may seem more economical in nature. Okay, so you have 2 car dealerships. Let's just say you have 2 car dealerships in town. 2 car dealerships now I'm sorry I'm having to write this out here, but this is okay. There's not much writing. So you have 2 car dealerships in town, and maybe it's Claremore, and let's give them names. I don't know, Bert and Ernie. Not very original, right? Bert and Ernie car dealership. So here's the deal Bert and Ernie have. They can either advertise, okay, or don't advertise. That makes sense? They can advertise or they can not advertise. So I'm going to make this little payoff matrix here. And you used to construct these things in my sleep, but I don't. But I kind of did this before class, so I hope it works out okay. I think it will. But we all know it costs money to advertise, right? It costs money to advertise. So if Bert and Ernie, who are the only games in town, typically say split the market in Claremore, Bert sells half the cars, Ernie sells half. Then if they both advertise, they're still going to split the market. Or if they don't advertise, both of them don't, they're going to split the market. But if they could both agree and enforce an agreement to not advertise, their profits would be higher. Why? Because it costs money to advertise. So I'm going to make this little payoff matrix, kind of like the one we just did, okay? Draw these little lines like this. So if they both don't advertise, they're going to have high profits. Let's just say they split the market. It's $2 million, okay? $2 million. Now, if Bert advertises and Ernie doesn't advertise, well, guess what? Bert's going to get a lot more business than Ernie, right? So maybe this is $3 million. And Ernie gets $500,000. Does that make sense? Because why do you advertise in the first place? It helps your profits. So presumably if Bert runs an ad in the Sunday paper and Ernie doesn't, then Bert's going to do a lot better for the week. And conversely here, if Ernie advertises, he might get $3 million, and if Bert doesn't. So notice how there's still, it's still a $4 million market, right? There's only $4 million worth here of automobiles sold here, but it could be the advertising brings more people in. So these are profits. So you say, well, wait a minute. Wouldn't advertising cost money, so that's going to hurt, so forth. But however, the industry's advertising may bring in more revenue. So you kind of have offsetting effects. Yes, it does cost to advertise, but if the industry as a whole is advertising, you convince some people to buy a new car who otherwise wouldn't. So at any rate, so you have this, and then what if they both advertise? Well, they still split the market. If they both advertise, they're going to split the market, but since it costs money to advertise, their profits here aren't as big as they would be over here. Because those ads are pretty expensive in the paper. So here is a payoff matrix. They call this a payoff matrix. And let me tell you, it's illegal in the United States for a cartel to exist in the auto dealership industry in a small town. So if this is Claremore, it's illegal for these two people to come together and say, you know what, we'd be better off if we didn't advertise. So let's just agree between us to not advertise. This would be, again, what I call the social optimal. This is what's optimal for the industry, if you will. Well, because, I mean, they're both, total here is $4 million. I guess I say, as you might ask, well, how's that better than this? Well, I guess when I made this out, it wasn't, I could have tweaked the numbers a little bit, so I'm going to do this on the fly, which is okay. I'm going to make that 0.4 million, okay, which fixes it completely. Again, I did this right before I came. All right, but the industry here is 3.4 million. Here has 4. Here it's got 3.4. So the industry is better off here. But is this where the industry is going to gravitate? Well, it would be here if they can collude. If they can get together and Bert and Ernie can say, hey, if you advertise, we're going to put a hit on your Uncle Charlie, what have you. All right? But that's illegal. Well, murder's illegal for one thing. But then this collusive behavior is illegal in the United States. So because collusive behavior, price fixing, or this kind of fixing, if you will, advertising fixing, is illegal in the United States, it's a violation of antitrust law, then it's like the prisoner's dilemma. The prisoners were separated, right? They can't come together and enforce an agreement between them. So each one of these, it turns out, has what's called a dominant strategy. So the social optimum will not be obtained here. So Ernie looks at Bert, and Ernie's trying to figure out what to do. So here's the deal, okay? I like to embellish these stories a little bit, but if you're going to have an ad in the Sunday paper, you have to have it down at the newspaper at 5 o'clock on Thursday. Big full-page ad in the newspaper. You got to have it down there at 5 o'clock on Thursday afternoon if you're going to get in this Sunday's paper. So you know what these guys are doing on Thursday afternoon? They got their spies out. And each one of them's got their binoculars, and they're looking over at the other, and they're waiting to see if somebody's going to slip out the back door of their establishment and make their way down to the newspaper. They don't trust each other. If one can slip out the back door without being detected, they will. Why? Because each one of these guys has a dominant strategy. Ernie looks at Bert, and Ernie says, you know what? If Bert doesn't advertise, I'm better off if I advertise. See, which would you rather have, $3 million in profit or 2? I'd rather have $3 million. If Bert advertises, then Ernie's better off if he advertises as well. Okay, which would you rather have, $0.4 million or 1.5? You see how Ernie, when he's looking at Bert and wondering what Bert's going to do, is better off if he chooses this block over this one or this block over this one. In other words, Ernie has a dominant strategy. Ernie, dominant strategy, advertise. ADV. How about Bert? I think you'll see where we're going here. Bert has a dominant strategy as well. Bert looks at Ernie and says, well, if Bert doesn't advertise, I'd be better off with $3 million in profit than 2, so I better advertise. Or if he advertises, I'd be better off with $1.5 million than $0.4 million. Either way, he's better off on the right than any sale on the left. So Bert will also choose to advertise. Both of these have a dominant strategy. And so the game, if you will, winds up here. This is that equilibrium, Nash equilibrium I was talking about. I'm just going to write equilibrium because there's a little more to the Nash equilibrium here than what I'm actually describing. And I don't want to write something that's not exact. But it's an equilibrium for this game. This is where the industry is better off. When you talk about the car industry, car dealership industry in a small town, total profits of $4 million is better than total profits of $3 million. However, collusion is not allowed under U.S. law. So this is where each player is going to drive the game. They're going to drive it here to this equilibrium. Okay, so makes you wonder about this thing here. Invisible hand, does it not? That's the metaphor that Adam Smith used to say that if individuals pursue their own best interest, society or the broader economy is better off. Certainly this industry is not better off. If you just look at the industry is not better off when the individuals here, under the constraints of antitrust law, pursue their own best interest. Okay, so you see the problem for Adam Smith? Does it make sense? Now, what is it maybe we're overlooking? This is kind of worthy of, I hope I've communicated this well. But, and your view is as good as mine, so forth. But when I say that, in fact, the line in that movie, if you want to watch it's a pretty good movie, A Beautiful Mind. It was like 30, 40 years ago. Before y'all were born, but it's about famous economists. But what he says in that movie, at the instant when he kind of realizes a situation at work like this one here, he says the following. He says, Adam Smith was wrong. He says, Adam Smith was wrong. And it looks like maybe here's a situation where the invisible hand breaks down. Okay? However, maybe we're not seeing the whole picture here. What do you think? Well, certainly the industry itself is not better off here than it is here. The industry, but perhaps the broader economy, the whole economy is better off because the industry is driven here. And that's the point. That's why we have antitrust laws in the first place, is because there's another party here, okay? There are two car dealers, two sellers, but there's a buyer, right? Who's representing the buyer in this little payoff matrix? Where are the buyer's preferences here stated? And they're not, okay? So if we back off of this myopic field of view here and look at the broader economy and factor in the buyers of automobiles, then of course the whole economy there may indeed be better off here. That's the rationale, at least, behind antitrust laws in the first place. So whether it's the establishment of antitrust laws through legislation, or whether it's the actions the executive arm of our federal government may take in breaking up monopolies or forbidding monopolies or oligopolies, that is, to form in the first place, the idea is that somebody is looking out for the consumer. Someone has to look out for the consumer. And laws are in place and they are enforced on behalf of people like you and me. We don't sell cars. Maybe you do. It's okay. I don't own a car dealership at any rate, but I buy cars from time to time. And so if we had that person represented in this matrix, then again, we might see that society, when we talk about society as a whole, is better off when the industry goes to this quadrant. Okay, so what's the point here again? All right, cartels are notoriously unstable. OPEC is a prime example. I know there are drug cartels too. We could talk about that. How you got the Sinaloa cartel. You got all these cartels that divvy up the market, don't they? I mean, in these big cities. And the mob used to be in New York City. You had a different family that ruled one of the 5 boroughs. You know, you had different, and I don't know all the detail on that, but I'm just saying that there's this kind of collusive behavior that occurs in illegal cartels, certainly, and so forth. But OPEC can do this sort of thing. They can say, hey, you know, let's not produce so much. So instead of don't advertise and advertise, it may be let's produce less than 10% of that 38%. And maybe each one of them agree to a quota. But when they get back home, they're not facing each other across the table. The ministers aren't. And so there's this incentive to overproduce at the higher established price. So you think about that a second. if Saudi Arabia has an incentive to cheat, so does Iran, so does Iraq, so does Venezuela, which is also an OPEC country. They all have the incentive. So when I say cartels are notoriously unstable, like OPEC, they all want to cheat after they come together every 6 weeks. They all want to cheat. So if they all did cheat, guess what? There will be a drop in the price of oil, their product, on global markets. One can cheat, and that's not going to have a big effect on the price of oil. That $60 a barrel, I haven't looked at the price of it, it's higher than that. But of crude oil here of late, it's coming out, it's going to a refinery across the pond somewhere, but $60 a barrel will be supported pretty well if only one country, if it's not Saudi Arabia. If only one country cheats, that's okay. All right. But if they all cheat, then there's an increase in supply on the global market. So at any rate, this kind of models cartel behavior, in particular, like I say, OPEC. Okay, so this is one of the three models I wanted to talk about today of oligopoly behavior, kind of an extreme oligopoly is a cartel where they do, there's no bones about it, it's very emphatic, it's very over, in a way it's in some sense overt. It may be illegal, so they can't do it in the United States, but there's price fixing or there's market quotas established, and so forth. The other one I want to talk about here is what's called the kink demand curve. Let's see if I can find a picture of this. It's on PowerPoint here. If we can go back to the PowerPoint. Oh, by the way, be sure you, on the PowerPoint here, if we can go back to the slides here, this one's illustrated in your book. Here's a prisoner's dilemma, okay? In fact, this one right here, they talk about a pricing strategy for these two firms that make up pretty much an industry. And they can either price high or price low. Now here's the dilemma, if you will, that always is not whether you're going to jail or not, or whether to advertise or not. It's simply your pricing strategy. For the firms that make up a cartel or oligopoly, their pricing strategy is affected by the behavior that their opponents are going to engage in, or at least they think they will. Thelma's going to confess, okay, because she's pretty sure Louise is going to confess, okay? Or either way, okay, she has a dominant strategy. Without going back and telling that story here, I may have said that incorrectly, but I've switched over here to this pricing strategy. Here's the deal. In an oligopoly, you always have this incentive to, well, you want to raise your price if your neighbor's going to raise their price too. If you can collude, okay? You'll raise your price if your neighbor will raise their price. In other words, you won't confess if your neighbor doesn't confess, okay? But the worst spot you can be in is to raise your price and your neighbor not raise their price. Guess what? Look here at Rare Air's pricing strategy. They can either go high or low, okay? So here, if they go with a low price and their competitor keeps a high price, they get a lot of market share. So notice they have a $15 million profit here available to them with a low price strategy. If you're the only one to lower your price, you're going to get the lion's share of the market. And that's what Rare Earth has figured out here. So if Uptown stays pat with a high price, Rare Earth cleans up by charging a low price. Okay? So, but notice, Rare Earth is also going to think to themselves, well, what if Uptown lowers their price? Well, Rare Earth would be better off by lowering their price as well. In other words, Rare Earth here has a dominant strategy. You see that? It's to lower their price, not to raise their price. Now, if you're locked in a cartel or something, and this is what OPEC does, let's raise the price of crude oil, okay? You're only going to do well if everybody hangs together. But again, there's no honor among thieves. So here what we have is a dominant strategy for both of these people. You can look at it the other way as well. is they may have hammered out an agreement to keep prices high, but each one, when they break from the meeting, is going to go back and say, let's lower our price. Because they do better off by lowering their price. Rare earth would rather have $15 million in profit instead of 12, or $8 million instead of 6. So this is a classic prisoner's dilemma, okay? Now notice, the industry, the HVAC industry, or whatever this is, does better off in the upper left-hand quadrant. Total industry profits are $24 million. That's a lot better than $16 million. But this is where the game's going to go. So you have this equilibrium, okay, this Nash equilibrium, if you will, is really what it is, where the game will go to as a result of each one of these individuals having a dominant strategy. And once they're there, there's really no incentive for them to move off of that equilibrium position. So I want you to be familiar with this. Again, this is the philosophy behind antitrust law and so forth. This kink demand curve that I alluded to here is pictured in this diagram here. Now I want us to, just for the moment here, and we kind of limited on time, but there's this idea, if you look at the picture on the left, if I can get my little cursor over there. Where's my cursor? Okay, there it is. This is a demand curve, and it's kind of unusual. This is for an oligopoly. This could be, again, a petroleum industry. There's 8 firms that account for 90% of the output, say, I don't know if that's true or not, of crude oil in the world, okay? It has a kink in it. You really see this with like breakfast cereals and so forth. There aren't that, we could go back and look at that table, but there aren't that many breakfast cereal companies. What you see that characterizes, like the breakfast cereal, the soft drink industry, and so forth, those industries in particular, you see a lot of price stability. Prices don't change much. We've said here that the members of an oligopoly will compete, but generally on a dimension other than price. So if you think about soft drinks for a moment, for sure, Big Soda, I talked about Big Soda, Coca-Cola and PepsiCo, and Keurig Dr. Pepper, and so forth. You know, the price of soda doesn't change very much, right? I mean, now here, I'm going to date myself, but I remember when you could buy a big bottle of Coca-Cola for 10 cents. Okay, so in my school at lunch, you could go to the machine, put a dime in, I don't know what it costs now, but at any rate, those prices don't change very much. That's an industry where the prices are very stable. For the most part, like breakfast cereals, kind of the same way and so forth. Now, if you think about those industries, the cost of inputs do go up and down. Like if you're making breakfast cereal, wheat and oats and those sorts of things that are inputs to making breakfast cereal, those prices are somewhat volatile. They jump up and down. But the output from that product industry has a very stable price. This kink demand curve model kind of explains that. And it's based on this premise, okay, that if you're a producer in an oligopoly, if you raise your prices, you're liable to find yourself stepping out on a limb by yourself. The others in your club are going to go, okay, you go ahead, and they'll wave at you. If you raise your prices a little bit, you lose a lot of market share. If you lower your prices, then that will be matched by your neighbors, your competitors, okay? Because they want to keep up with you. If you were the only one to lower your price, you'd clean up. If you're the only one to raise your price, you lose out. Does that make sense? So wherever the price for your final commodity is, be it a soft drink or breakfast cereal, wherever that price is set, puts a little bend in the demand curve. So you see here in the picture on the right, well, on the left in particular, this is a demand curve, it says D1. This is for the industry, okay? And actually, let me say, I said it's for the industry, but this is for an individual in the industry. This is their demand curve for an individual supplier. It's got this little kink in it here. Now, what's this saying? Wherever the price is set in the market at P sub 0, if you were to raise your price a little bit, then guess what? You lose a lot of market share. So the individual demand curve is very price elastic above the current market price. Very price elastic. In other words, you see that demand curve is almost flat. So if you're going to raise your price a little bit, you lose a lot of market share. You would zip over to the left. However, if you lower your price a little bit, then a price decrease on your part will be matched by your rivals. And so the industry as a whole may sell more, and so you may sell more, but not that much more. You're not going to cut into somebody else's market share. You may grow the whole industry, the whole market, if you lower the price of Coca-Cola and Pepsi and Dr. Pepper at the same time. There may be more soft drinks sold, but it's not like one firm is going to invade the market space of another. So, you see, for an individual supplier in that industry, the demand curve still slopes downward, as it should by the law of demand, but not as steeply as it does here. So, if an individual lowers their price, it will be matched, presumably, by the other firms. You will sell more units of output, but not that much more. So it puts this little, well, they call it a kink in the demand curve, okay? This little thing right here. Kind of an interesting anomaly, if you will, about this market structure. Isn't that kind of interesting? It's got that little bend. Again, it's built on the behavioral assumption that price increases will not be matched, price decreases will be matched. Well, because of that kink in the demand curve, you have a gap in the marginal revenue curve for each individual supplier. Remember what we talked about before when we introduced firms with market power like monopolies? We said that the marginal revenue curve, and you see it on the right here, is always twice as steep as the demand curve. Anytime that demand curve individual demand curve slopes downward, there's a marginal revenue curve below it, just twice as steep. We looked at the geometric argument for that. So notice for the upper section of the demand curve, there's a marginal revenue curve here. Y'all see that? Connects to point F. And then for the second segment of the individual demand curve, there's a section of the marginal revenue curve way down here. I mean, how do we get those? You see this on the left. Okay, you just kind of have to follow these marginal revenue curves back, all the way back. Each one of these marginal revenue curves looks like the demand curve, except they're twice as steep. We saw that. Okay, that was a previous observation we made. Okay, a kinked demand curve will produce a gapped marginal revenue curve. You say, well, big deal. Okay, big deal. Well, here's the big deal about that. Is if this is soft drink or breakfast cereal, something like that, the price of those inputs can go up and down, wheat, oats, and what have you, which would cause this marginal cost curve. See MC1, MC2? That thing could go up and down a lot because input prices are volatile. But the point at which the marginal cost curve intersects the marginal revenue curve on the horizontal axis, that is, what quantity equates marginal cost to marginal revenue, is not going to be affected by movements in the marginal cost curve. And why do we care about that? Because again, the profit maximizing supplier always equates marginal cost to marginal revenue, right? Always equate marginal cost to marginal revenue. That's where your profits are going to be maximized. So there's a lot of points here on the right from F to G where the marginal cost equals the marginal revenue. And so the quantity is not affected. The profit maximizing quantity is not affected by shifts in the marginal cost curve, the cost of inputs. The price that this industry will charge, or this individual will charge for their output, is going to be stable. Okay, it's found up here on the demand curve, just as we've done before. So you can have volatility in the marginal cost does not affect the price charged to the consumer. So it's kind of like having good shock absorbers on your car, right? See a car going down the street ahead of you. Their tires may be doing this, but the people in the car are floating. Okay, there's no difference right there, okay? Now, the shortcoming to this model is that it doesn't explain why the kink is at that price P sub 0 in the first place. It just assumes its existence. But it doesn't tell you why it was there in the first place. Why is it at that position in the first place? That is a major shortcoming of this particular model. We'll pick up with this next time.